Welcome to the second webinar in the series on equity work for educator teams. This series builds on Colleen Capper's ideas and insights, perspectives she shared in a recent interview. Whereas the first webinar in the series focused on fundamentals of equity work, this one focuses on putting those fundamentals into practice. My name is Margette Dudek. I am a consultant to the OPEP project at the University of Cincinnati's Systems Development and Improvement Center. OPEP, by the way, stands for Ohio Partnership for Excellence in Paraprofessional Preparation. Let me start by introducing Dr. Colleen Capper. Dr. Capper is professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is co-founder of Integrated Comprehensive Systems for Equity and co-founder and co-director of the National Leadership for Social Justice Institute and Academy. Her research and teaching focus on systems change in educator preparation, in schools, and in districts to advance the learning of all students and to eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps. Please stop the video for a few minutes and talk with one or more colleagues to answer the following question. What would a safe, equitable school environment look like? Maybe you described a safe, equitable school environment using statements such as, children feel safe, children are open about sharing their opinions, and children all have the same opportunities to get instructional help and enrichment. That's a great start. In the previous webinar, we talked about the fundamental ideas behind equitable practice. We talked in particular about terminology, comparing the terms equality, equity, and inclusion. We also talked about the importance of creating an inclusive culture focused on equity, and about the ways a co-plan to co-serve model can promote equity and inclusion. In this webinar, we pick up the thread by returning to our discussion of the co-plan to co-serve model. Then we talk about practices for creating heterogeneous learning in environments that maintain a focus on equity. The webinar covers 3 topics: committing to and enacting co-plan to co-serve team structures, creating heterogeneous learning environments and proportional representation, and developing and maintaining a focus on equity practices. Each slide in this webinar features an icon that corresponds to the topic being addressed. A visual network icon represents co-plan to co-serve team structures. A classroom icon designates content relating to creating heterogeneous learning and environments. And a balance scale appears on all slides relating to the focus on equity. Icons appear in the upper right-hand corner of each slide. The co-plan to co-serve model helps each student in a classroom get what he or she needs through inventive approaches to lesson planning, delivery, and support, such as co-teaching and universal design for learning, UDL for short. The conversations that take place in co-plan to co-serve teams not only result in inviting and dynamic lessons, they also support professional learning. The practices that co-plan to co-serve teams use are so powerful, in fact, that they would benefit all other collaborative teams of educators, teacher-based teams, building leadership teams, district leadership teams, and IEP teams. These practices include committing to non-negotiables focused on equity, making sure students are assigned to heterogeneous groups, and making sure that adequate and well-qualified staff provide support to all students. As you might suspect, these practices don't just happen on their own. They come from the concerted efforts of leaders across an entire school district and in each school in the district. Keep in mind, as well, that the term leader applies to everyone in the district who provides leadership, not just the administrators. Parapros, teachers, principals, related services personnel, and others all exercise leadership when they advocate and use the practices that promote equity and inclusion. Co-plan to co-serve teams differ somewhat from TBTs in Ohio, but they have a lot in common. They are alike because both sorts of teams focus on instruction, and both sorts of teams also focus on equity. TBTs, however, have a broader mission than co-plan to co-serve teams. A good way to think about it is this. Sometimes TBTs have co-plan to co-serve discussions, especially when they are talking about instructional practices. But not all TBT discussions are co-plan to co-serve discussions. Also, some co-plan to co-serve discussions take place outside of the TBTs. For instance, when the general education teacher, intervention specialist, and the parapro, who all work together in one classroom, meet to determine what instructional practices to use or how best to design a formative assessment. Now it's time for a turn and talk activity. Briefly talk to one or more colleagues about school-wide practices that encourage all members of a school community to treat each other with respect. Then consider how a culture of respect helps a school maintain its focus on equity. In what ways does respect contribute to equity? In what ways do equitable practices communicate respect? The way we act every day in our schools conveys messages about our values, and the students pick up on these messages right away. If we show genuine respect for children, for instance, they will learn to respect us as well as their peers. Respect depends on valuing each person equally and viewing each person's contribution to the community as equally valuable. The justification for giving each student what he or she needs is the fact that we see that student as being just as important as any other student. So, making sure we respect every member of the school community is a great start. Core values such as these are sometimes called non-negotiables. Equity non-negotiables are especially important. They help the adults communicate good ways for everyone to work together for the good of the whole school and district community. What are equity non-negotiables? Where do they come from? Here is what Colleen Capper has to say. She starts off with some history.
We need to know how we got here, like the history of public education to begin with, and that public schools from their design in the very beginning in the United States were not designed for all students. They were set up for certain demographics, so white, typically male, and middle to upper class, and like that's what they were set up for. And so from the very beginning of our public school system, they weren't set up in the first place to be equitable. And then came along compulsory education. Then we had to take all students. But then when that happened, we ended up often setting up separate schools. That's right. Students with disabilities had separate schools, students labeled ELL, Native Americans, all this sort of separate school going on. And so understanding that history and like how we got here in the first place, I think is an important start. And then, and then another step in that is, basically drawing out how the current educational structure in our school, how are we currently educating our students, and getting that on paper, and then having an understanding about how our current structure reflects that history, like how is our history reflected in how we're currently educating students. So having that understanding, being able to analyze our current structure, and look at, what are the challenges of the current structure that we currently have.
Here's an example Dr. Capper brought to our attention. The Monona-Grove School District in Wisconsin has a set of 7 equity non-negotiables. 1. Monona-Grove district employees share responsibility for the prevention of student failure. 2. Principles of natural proportions are used in placing students in classrooms, so the composition of every classroom mirrors the composition of the community as a whole. 3. All learners participate in high-quality core instruction within heterogeneous groups. That is, there's no grouping by ability. 4. Instruction is differentiated for all learners in each classroom using a framework that provides options for student engagement, representation of content, and student self-expression. 5. Educators with a range of expertise are intentionally aligned to create teams that increase one another's capacity through a co-planning and co-serving model in support of all learners. 6. Personalized profiles are used for all learners to assist educators in determining appropriate instructional practices and documenting progress and goals. 7. All district policies and procedures leverage support for high-quality, differentiated instruction for all learners. What do equity non-negotiables look like? Let's start with some ideas from Dr. Capper.
I think what we talk about in our work is then knowing how to develop equity non-negotiables. It's the reverse of the problems of the system that guide all decisions in the school district. So understanding about that and how that can guide our practice. Knowing how to proportionally represent students across a school, and then how to assign staff to meet student needs in that system. And then knowing how to co-plan and co-serve, how to be on a grade level team, and how to then design lessons from the ground up so that you know how to meet the range of student needs in your classroom.
How can we do this work? It might make sense for us to begin with a few short and simple non-negotiables, perhaps starting with a statement about a core value or belief and then moving on to related practices. The slide includes an example. Here's the belief statement. All children deserve access to the knowledge and skills that are taught through the general education core curriculum. Students are assigned randomly to classrooms. The core curriculum is used as the foundation of instructional plans for all students. The change from separate curricula to a common curriculum has many challenges, and it requires commitment from the entire district. This change and other equity changes benefit from the involvement of leadership teams, as Dr. Capper explains.
So in a very practical level, the way to build teacher capacity of the teachers to do the work, we talk about 3 just very basic teams in a school district. So one, you would have a district leadership team that's very purposely engaged in the work and in the equity systems change work. You have a school leadership team, which is very purposive about who's on that leadership team. A person from every grade level is on the team. A general educator from each grade level, and then a special education teacher, a teacher of students who are labeled ELL. If you have a teacher of students working with students labeled gifted, you probably have your school psychologist on there, maybe a school counselor, maybe an interventionist. And so that's your school leadership team, and it's like that team who learns about equity systems change and like are guiding that work forward with the rest of the staff in the school. So the principal obviously is a key part of that, but it's not the principal standing alone. It's about this team that's actually then they learn about the work, and then they learn how to facilitate that work with the rest of the staff. So that's the school leadership team, and they have to meet regularly, and we have a whole structure and process for that. And then the third team are co-plan to co-serve teams. So those are grade level teams, and so if you have 4 or 5 teachers at 4th grade, so you'd have the 4th grade co-plan to co-serve team. I think in Ohio you call them teacher-based teams. So we call them co-plan to co-serve teams, and then on that co-plan to co-serve team, depending on student needs at the 4th grade, you would have maybe a special educator on that team. Maybe the ELL person is assigned to that team if there are students labeled ELL. Maybe there's a speech pathologist on that team, maybe the OT or PT. And so then that co-plan to co-serve team meets on a regular basis, and then their work is lesson design, designing lessons around the range of learners in 4th grade. They wrap their arms around all the learners who are in 4th grade as an example. And so that's where you can bring, and then paraprofessionals, coming back to the topic, we think should be part of that team. And so, they should be part of that team. And then that's one way to develop the capacity for paraprofessionals, is that then you're learning with each other, and then you're learning in practice. So it's not like you're having to learn something over here and then bring it and transfer it into your practice as a teacher. You're building each other's capacity around the table when you're meeting about how to support students with language needs across the day, rather than just being pulled out down the hall, which is what's happening often with pull-out services. So it's not that the special education teacher in the resource room is not a great teacher. They are a great teacher. How can we bring that special ed expertise to bear across all students in that 4th grade? Or the student, teacher of students labeled ELL is a great teacher down the hall, but instead of having her down the hall doing ELL pull-out, she's part of that team and and then having conversations when they're designing lessons about how to support all students around language. And so it's a natural way of building capacity, about building capacity of teachers, because they're actually having to design lessons with each other, drawing on each other's expertise for their students in the class. And so it's very intentional too about who's on that team. And it's a process that the schools should go through every spring. When they're assigning kids for the next year and staff, you get very specific about, in fourth grade, are going to proportionally represent students across these fourth grade classrooms. These are the student needs. This is the expertise of those fourth grade teachers. These are the fourth grade teachers who are duly certified in special ed or reading or whatever. We get their expertise on the table. These are the student needs. Okay, now who else do we need to add to that team in order to be able to support students in the work? And so that's coming back to this, collaborative equity capacity. Like, that's how it happens, is in these conversations, because what we say is that we have all the expertise in the school to do the work. It's already there.
Let's unpack what Dr. Capper is suggesting here. First, she reminds us to make sure there is wide representation on leadership teams. Not just general educators, but other experts in the grade levels and student populations the team is focused on as well. Second, she talks about how important it is to get each team member to identify his or her areas of expertise. Third, she thinks each team member should discuss his or her expertise and how those funds of knowledge contribute to addressing the matters at hand. Fourth, she notes the value of finding ways for team members to support one another, to develop certain specific capacities, practices, or strategies that will be implemented. Fifth, she thinks teams need to learn together and from one another as they choose, refine, and learn new attitudes, practices, skills, and strategies. Finally, it's important to allow the team members to decide if they need to add new members, tools, or routines to leadership meetings in order to fill in gaps in expertise. Developing non-negotiables is key. Also important is finding equitable ways to assign students to classrooms. We call this type of assignment proportional representation. What is proportional representation? What are heterogeneous learning environments? When students can say, everyone at this school has the same chances to take any class, and every student at this school will be heard and helped, then you're looking at a school that is closing the opportunity gap. Creating proportional representation in heterogeneous learning environments is a good way to accomplish this goal. Proportional representation means that in any given class, you will see a wide range of students. The variability of students in each classroom will, in fact, match the variability of all students in the community that the school serves. Proportional representation means that the school and district do not use ability grouping. Learning environments are heterogeneous. That is, they are diverse in character, and differences among students are valued because they add to the overall diversity and therefore richness of the classroom, school, and district. Here's what Dr. Capper had to say about proportional representation.
We talk about proportional representation so that students should be demographically proportionally represented across environments as a foundation, because when students are not proportionally represented, the opposite of that is that they're segregated in some way. I mean, the opposite of proportional representation is segregation. And so what we say in our work with equity systems change is that we can't have equity and segregation happening at the same time. Like, they don't go together. And so we can't be doing that, segregating students, again, with good intention, and then expect that we're going to advance equity at the same time. Like, the best way that kids learn is to learn in heterogeneous learning environments. And our data bears that out. The research bears that out.
In other words, when students see one another, they can learn from one another. If they are separate from one another, they don't have that opportunity. Let's stop the webinar for a minute and talk about equity practices. In this turn and talk, we'll be focusing on the various ways segregation has become part of our world. The big question is this: if we can stop using segregation in classrooms, schools, and districts, how might that affect our wider world? How are groups in your community segregated? What would your community be like if these forms of segregation no longer existed? How are employees segregated in your school and district? What would your school district be like if these forms of segregation no longer existed? How are students in your school district segregated? What would your school district be like if these forms of segregation no longer existed? And now the big question, once again. If we can stop using segregation in classrooms, schools, and districts, how might that affect our wider world? Now that we've talked about establishing equity non-negotiables and assigning students using proportional representation, it's time to think about other steps for creating equity in schools and districts. The slide lists important steps. These are establishing equity non-negotiables, setting up and supporting leadership teams, identifying opportunity gaps and other inequities, figuring out which children are losing out as a result of opportunity gaps and inequities, deciding how to arrange classroom assignments and routines so that in every classroom there will be a variety of students, a variety of learning supports, and depth of content that reflects and respects that variety. Selecting and implementing effective instructional practices that support the learning of all students. Selecting and implementing district policies and procedures that close opportunity gaps, and supporting administrators, teachers, and paraprofessionals in the use of practices that expand both quality and equity. Sustaining equity requires educators to work in teams. Teams allow them to hold themselves and one another accountable, learn about, adopt, perfect, and test promising practices, collect data to see how well the promising practices are working, and refine practices or adopt more effective ones.
This is not something that districts go back and next spring we're going to now proportionally represent all our students and now we're going to create co-plan and co-serve teams. It's a process.
As Capper reminds us, equity work is a process. The important steps are: make equity the priority. Establish what you as an organization believe regarding equity. Decide what steps the adults need to take to implement high-quality, equitable instruction and supports. To do this, teams must value and make use of each member's knowledge and expertise. They should co-plan to co-serve, and they should support one another through leadership teams. This work improves children's learning experiences, learning outcomes, and life chances. For our final Turn and Talk activity, consider the following questions. In what ways can teachers support and coach paraprofessionals who join TBTs? How can teachers encourage paras to trust their own observations, insights, and skills? In what ways can teachers help paraprofessionals tap into their strengths as facilitators of students' learning? Discuss these questions in a small group. Then, draft a few, perhaps 3 or 4, coaching questions for teachers to use when they help paraprofessionals share their ideas in TBT meetings. One example might be, how will you know when an instructional practice is working with a student? Or here's another. In what ways can our team support you when you encounter a student for whom a certain instructional practice just isn't working? Finally, share your small group's questions with the group as a whole. On behalf of the Ohio Partnership for Excellence in Paraprofessional Preparation, thank you for taking the time to think about equity practices in your classroom, school, and district.